for the next lesson, I'm going to need a volunteer. But I need an atheist. So, Joel, you're an atheist, right? I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I enjoyed being your friend. But there's something I've been wanting to ask you about. And that's this. Let's suppose that this right here represents all of the knowledge in the universe. Okay? Right there, that circle. What percent of this knowledge, and you can illustrate that by drawing a big circle, little circle, whatever you want. What percent of the entire knowledge of the universe do you think you possess? What's that much? That much? Okay. Well, a fairly humble person. And that...
can't see your knowledge.
Can't see my knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge up there. Okay, do you think it's possible that the knowledge of God exists inside this circle here, this circle here, but hasn't yet gotten into that little circle that you drew that represented your own knowledge? Is it possible?
No.
It's not possible. Why not?
It's just like standing right up beside a barn. You know it's right there. It's a huge barn. So if God is really that big, we're going to know He's there. Because it's right there. He's that big.
Maybe you're denying the obvious. You have to admit that it's at least logically possible that the knowledge that God exists is out here in this area of knowledge and not in your area of knowledge.
Possible.
Okay, so it's possible. So really the most that you could be then is an agnostic, right? Maybe you don't know that there's a God. But you can't prove to me that there isn't, right? I mean, maybe that's just an aspect of your knowledge you don't have yet. And even if you're a hard agnostic and you don't believe that it's possible to know, maybe the knowledge that it is possible to know exists outside of your knowledge. You see what I'm saying? So,
reverse your arguments against you also.
you think you could reverse those arguments?
Just like you're assuming that the knowledge of God is possibly out here, or you're saying that that's a possibility. There's still just an amount of possibility that it's not there.
Okay.
So we're both at an equal plane.
You think, okay, well then we need to look at the evidence, don't we?
Mhm.
Okay. Before we look at the evidence then, let me share with you Pascal's wager. You heard of Pascal's wager and all of that? Okay, so what Pascal says, he says, look at this like making a bet. Okay? Let's say there's a 50-50 chance that God exists. Okay? Now, what would be the wisest thing for you to do? Let's say the evidence is fairly equal, could go either way, or maybe, this is my own interpretation, maybe there's even just a 20% chance that God exists. Okay? What would be the wisest thing to do? To bet that God exists, to wager that He does exist, or to wager that He doesn't exist? Now the implications of, if you're going to bet that He does exist, then you're going to live according to that, that sort of thing. Okay? So what do you think would be the best thing to bet? That He does exist. Do you understand why? Because if you bet that He does exist, and he does, then you win everything. If he doesn't exist, you bet on him, you really lost nothing. Look at the other way, though. If you bet that he doesn't exist, and he does, you've lost everything. Right? Wager then that God does exist. That's the wisest thing to do.
However, an all-knowing God would not accept a bet for salvation.
Well,
Even though that you're just betting on, it's not real faith.
well, it's what we're saying here is that we're choosing to go in that direction. We're choosing to believe and embrace that viewpoint, and then live according to it. It's not simply a bet. All right, so I think probably you could respond by saying something like, well, if the evidence for God were any better, then maybe I would believe. But the evidence for God is so minuscule that I'm willing to take the risk and to gamble that he doesn't exist. Right? I mean, you could say that. And that's why I want to talk to you about the evidence. But let's say that I can only bring this evidence up to, say, maybe 20%. So in your mind, it's more than likely that he doesn't exist than that he does. Would you say, let's then not believe? Or would it be wise, even with 20%, a 20% chance that he does exist, to believe? Let me illustrate it this way. Would you get into a plane that you knew had a 20% chance of crashing? Would you fly in a plane that you knew had a 20% chance of crashing?
Would you get into a plane that had an 80% chance of crashing and a 20% chance of surviving? That's what you're saying. You're saying that I believe that there's an 80% chance that the plane's going to crash, but you're telling me that there's a 20% chance that God exists or the plane's actually going to fly.
Well, I'm talking about the implications of it. If I believe that God doesn't exist and he does, then I'm in huge danger, right? I'll die and go to hell if the Christian view is right. All you're saying is, if you don't believe, well, there's no consequences to that. So, there's no risk. There's a huge difference. It's the difference between, flying on a plane and just, tripping. The difference in the consequences is a lot more significant. So, in other words, what I want to do is share with you some of this evidence and get it up to enough certainty in your own mind, enough probability in your mind, that you think it's probably wise to go ahead and embrace that. And so are you willing to talk about some of the evidence? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's do that today. Thank you, Joel. Let's give him a hand. Good job. You were a very good atheist. All right, so let me. In the PowerPoint, this is what represented that dot of someone's knowledge. Pascal's wager. Let's get the blanks in here. This is kind of the way he said it. Either God exists or he doesn't exist. What would be wiser, to believe that he does exist or to believe that he doesn't exist? Let's say that we put a wager on the idea that God exists. If we win this wager and he does exist, we win everything. If we lose and God doesn't exist, we lose nothing. Since this is the case, we should wager that God does exist. And I think even more importantly, reverse that and look at the consequences of believing that he doesn't exist if he does. Okay? You've lost everything if he does exist and you believe that he doesn't. Okay. So I moved Joel from being a complete atheist to being an agnostic to somewhat considering Pascal's wager and being willing to look at the evidence. Now, obviously, of course, he didn't seem to be real eager to hear all that evidence and was pretty skeptical. And I think it takes maybe more of a process. But any other reflection on that? You see how he tried to turn the tables on me? He said, well, maybe the knowledge that God doesn't exist outside your knowledge. So how do you respond to that?
That's possible.
Something cannot be and not be at the same time. If you know that God exists and then the knowledge of God not existing is somewhere out there, like that's a self-contradictory statement, is it not? Because something cannot be true and not be true at the same time in the same sense.
But nothing's 100%, so we don't actually know.
That's true.
100%.
Well, what kind of positive evidence do the atheists have to show that God does not exist?
Have a theory.
We have on our side a huge amount of evidence for God's existence. And what they do primarily is just try to poke holes in that. So the situation is a lot different. It's not like we're debating two theories that have equal amounts of evidence. Yeah.
Isn't that now the job when, as a Christian coming to an atheist? The atheist is now set for using courtroom. They're the defendant, and the job of the lawyers of the defendant is to poke holes in the prosecution. And if all the evidence does point that says the defendant's guilty, but the lawyer can point out some inconsistencies that show that it's maybe, nothing's 100% sure, then the prosecution loses. And so technically that is a job of the atheists.
Well,
we're the aggressors, and
they do try that. They try to show inconsistencies and that sort of thing, which we'll talk about next time.